Afternoon, everyone. Just reminding everybody that the first couple of workshops today are being live streamed and are open to the public. First of all, obviously, is the LTP Capital Program. Second one is, I can't remember now. I did look at it about half an hour ago. What's our next topic that's open? Oh, okay. Just noting that we've had apologies from Councillor Proctor, who is out of town today. Councillor Tamihana is at a tangi, but will get here shortly. And Councillor Boyle, Councillor Young have texted to say that they're just running a little bit late, but will also be here shortly. But we'll get underway. Thank you, Jacinda.
Thanks, everyone. So this presentation today should take, I know it's scheduled for a bit longer, but should really only be about 10 to 15 minutes maximum. The purpose of it is to talk through, just to recap on where we're at with the capital program and what the process between now and the adoption of the long-term plan is going to look like, particularly summarising the process for further review and prioritisation between now and adoption. So just a few assumptions just to work through and make sure that everybody's on the same page. So when we set the financial strategy, and we'll talk about the graph in a minute, we have the full capital program is currently included within the activity statements. That is part of the draft long-term plan that was signed off last week. And as part of that, within the financial strategy, because of the pressures around rates and borrowings, we have assumed a level of capital spending to make sure that we don't exceed the borrowings levels and also to limit the impact on rates for the first 3 years. Ideally, when you set a long-term plan, that actually what you can complete would be all that everybody sees in terms of a proposal, but we weren't at the stage yet to fully understand what was above the line and below the line. So in terms of that program, the full capital program is included within the activity statements, but within the financial strategy, our aim was to clearly outline that there is a difference between those things, and that between now and the end of April, we will do that prioritization exercise so that when we adopt the final budget, it will only be the schedules that people will see will be what is achievable in terms of that program rather than the full program. Now, there could be conversations that we might have between now and the end of June where we might actually choose to show the below the line, where we might have made decisions through this between now and the end of June where we want to give the public a view of what we've put below the line that we might not be able to achieve. So that is a conversation that we can have between now and the end of June. And it wasn't, what we're also going to make sure is included in what's on the website is a really clear disclosure note that to try and make sure we're being as clear as we can with the public. And this is something through the conversations with the community I think it's really important that we do try and stress whenever we can, is when they look at that activity statement and they see a project that they're really keen on, and it might be in year 1 or year 2, that actually we can't assure them at this stage that is actually going to happen in year 1 and 2, because that final decision about what's the highest priority hasn't yet been made by this table. And in terms of helping in some of the aids in terms of that conversation is that visual view for people in any given year. What is the ideal capital program, which is the turquoise blue or the lighter blue, that is included with it. So this is what's included within the activity statements. This is what we can realistically achieve from a borrowings perspective in that first 6 years. So while we have a full capital program that ideally we would like to achieve, because we're trying to limit the impact on debt and also the impact on rates, this is the level that realistically we can achieve, which has allowed us to be below our borrowings limit. So just to make sure, does anyone have any questions on that? Is there any areas where there's any questions or anyone would like to raise anything?
Yeah, Jacinda, I just wanted to raise that issue of well, it's not an issue. Like, if in any of the next 24 months, if there's asset sales where there's obviously we're receiving some funds, that will we have some sort of mechanism where anything below the line is prioritised, so that we go, well, if we get $2 million from asset sales, actually we'll proceed with these two items underneath the line because we've got capacity to do that? And I guess the same rationale is with if there was some unexpected grant funding for a capital project, it just means that we've got some extra capacity to do some other things if we want to, or will we deal with that on a sort of ad hoc decision basis?
It can probably happen in both ways. So that level of prioritization of that below the line might not be fully prioritized, because in the out years it's difficult for a 20-year program to do that. But you could, if there are specific projects that maybe this table would like to make sure are shown to the community that they're actually just next up, for example, then that's a conversation that you could have as part of finalizing the long-term plan. Also, it's the other bit that's probably important to note as well is the capital program and the level of work that Dan and his team are doing in particular is an evolving piece of work. And because it is a 20-year program, in the current long-term plan, we do have, in the draft long-term plan, I should say, the full 20-year program is covered over the 20-year period. When it happens is what's different in terms of that assumed delivery. So for us, we've got a program at the moment that meets the borrowings, meets this assumed level of delivery. At a point in time in the next few years, we might come to you, for example, and because there might be additional asset sales or there's some capacity here in the borrowings, and actually from a risk perspective, we want to have a conversation with you that it's actually more important to do that piece of work than it is to have that capacity in year 5 or 6. Then that may change as we evolve and understand what the program looks like in more detail. But at this stage, we would look to come back to you with a program, and at this stage, it's going to be at the end of April, with what that looks like with this capital program. And then if there are any changes that we might propose in terms of timing, given that there's more work being done, then that's something we may also want to discuss with you and to get your thoughts on.
Just following on from what Sam said around that, I mean, in the past we've used asset sales to reduce debt. And so I would imagine at some stage the conversation will have to be had, is it better to pay back debt, especially with current interest rates and things like that, which might give us actually a little bit more headroom to be able to do stuff. So I don't want to lose sight of the fact that we're just going to automatically assume that we can increase the capital program if we do have those asset sales.
No, thanks, and that's absolutely, yeah. So absolutely, it's a conversation to the table to weigh those things up. Absolutely, and then one benefit that we have in terms of the draft long-term plan as well now is because we've limited that assumption on what our asset sales may be to a much smaller number, that we don't have as much pressure on making sure that that is the case. Yeah. Councillor Grimstone.
I just had a question around correlating between the summary of capital projects spreadsheet that we've got and how it correlates to your forecast for debt spend. So the spreadsheet that at this stage is unprioritised and there's projected spend in there that will fall below the line or essentially won't happen in year 1 or 2.
That's correct. So effectively that detailed schedule that you have is that turquoise line there.
Cool.
And then what's in the debt picture, and looking at the colours, we should have correlated those better because I see that the next one actually, this is effectively the picture that relates to the prioritised list. Yes.
This is the order.
Councillor Jennings.
Just the other question was, with the proposed targeted rate around the landfill, this is a point that was raised at the NLGs today, was just around, is the funding for the remediation and all the stages, is it, I think the word they use is guaranteed, but that targeted rate is kind of hypothecated for landfill purposes. And so how do we reflect that in the capital program? Because obviously, I think for the first 3 years, the actual amount that we need to do the works probably exceeds what we're going to bring in through that targeted rate. So it's presumably it's a internal loan, well, not internal loan, but there's some sort of accounting treatment that shows that. Like, can you just talk to that, just to get so I get my head right?
Sure. So that's probably the area that it's treated a little bit differently, the landfill. And so in terms of the landfill and the assumptions around that, we have the 4.7 of debt associated with the landfill that we're going to repay over 20 years. So it doesn't get built into the capital program, but it does reduce debt. So if you look at and that's where we start to try and show you that movement in borrowings more regularly rather than just capex and debt, because there are other things like the asset sales, repayment of debt of the landfill that affect debt that aren't necessarily capital related. So that's something we can make sure we're clear on as we work through the reporting. So from that side, we're paying back the 4.7 million worth of debt, but also that program, when Stantec, for example, or when a review is done of what do we need to spend in each year for the landfill remediation for the 30 years, then we look at that, we build in that program in terms of what's needed in those given years, but it won't show up in the capital program because it's treated a bit differently. Yeah.
Just following on from, I suppose, Mayor Birdie's comments around that debt ceiling and stuff, I guess it's important to make sure that we've got capacity there if we do need to bring some renewals forward. And I suppose when you look at sort of year 1 to 5, like we're not maxed out, but there's not a massive amount there. If we had a reasonable sort of water issue or whatever, we need to bring something forward. I suppose it's just mindful of making sure we have got capacity, isn't it?
It's a very good point. And also things like, for example, Waka Kotahi reviewing their funding model and understanding is the percentage that we're going to stay the same. Making sure that there is some capacity for things that we're not sure of as well. Yeah, for sure. Okay, so what I'll talk through next is just next steps and what that will look like. So between now and the end of April, the team are working to make sure that understanding of what the proposed or what we'd like to talk to you about are recommendations around prioritization in terms of above the line for yes, it will be delivered within our funding limits, or at this stage we can't do it in the early years, we need to wait till later. We will provide you with a proposed program for feedback at the end of April, and that will include that what's above the line and what's below the line. Then in early May, we propose that we would have, and apologies for the Z there, we will have a workshop with you to talk through those, get your feedback, get some feedback, and make sure there's a robust discussion about that you understand why and what the proposals are. Because we have deliberations, this is around the time that we'll have hearings as well in early May. Deliberations will happen at the end of May, so you'll have that understanding and knowledge as you work through May. And then you won't make a decision on it until we finalise the adoption of the LTP at the 26th of June. And at that point, that capital program within each activity statement will then match these lines here, so that it'll be really clear for the community what is going to be delivered and what won't be able to be delivered. But if there are some things, as you talked about, where you want to be really clear with the community about what's next up if we've got some capacity, then that's absolutely something that we can incorporate into the messaging. Dan, is there anything else you or Monique want to add to?
Yeah, I suppose yes, just not underestimating the amount of work in order to reshape that program, and obviously we'll need to ensure that we come in at a couple of touch points throughout April to check in with elected members and just ensure we're tracking well, and just reiterating the point that there will be some areas of focus that are of interest, and we'll need that direction to ensure that there's some clarity on which projects are likely to make the cut and which ones sit in that more deferral bucket, just to ensure that we meet that goalpost of each financial year's commitment of projects. In our 20-year program, which is obviously reviewed periodically, but we've got to draw a line in the sand there. And certainly historically, we've set a large program we haven't necessarily delivered. So the idea is to try and pair delivery with available budget and do that in a more proactive way.
Councillor Tukupa.
Pleased to hear that there'll be a number of touch points prior to the end of April, because if it was just end of April, that's not good enough for me. Like, we've got the all-in version, and some of them, like I've gone through, I got it printed. There's things in there that we've already discussed in workshops and said, well, there wasn't a decision as such, but there was strong signals about what should be in and out, and I'd be disappointed if they still stayed in. For example, library books, there was a strong sense that $5 per person by population was a good mark, and in year one it still states that it's 360,000, which you'd be accommodating 72,000 people at that number. So it's like more than double our population. I just want to be sure that, and I mean, I could rattle on a whole lot of other stuff in here that I thought would have moved by now. And I just don't want to be under the pump come April and we're making decisions in May, June, and you as an elected member, you feel backed into a corner sometimes because you don't now have the time to change something. So I'm just letting you know, I hope that we get ample opportunity, and it's not just officers go away, what's in, what's out, and we get a version that we can't really move much.
And I guess my question is around how we involve the public in this, in the prioritisation process. There's an issue that Monique and I have discussed affecting Foxton Eastern Park that really has had no profile other than to alert the rugby club in that case. So it sparked in me a concern that those projects, which by their very nature are probably discretionary, set alongside the core business and the things it faces, how we can give profile to those CapEx proposals to ensure that the public have a voice in this process of prioritising it. So the question is, how do we achieve that?
I think that for year one of the LTP, we're probably pretty close to demonstrating how we can get that capital program down from the 72 up there down to 40, so that we could demonstrate what are the consequences of that and allow those organisations or individuals within our community to understand the consequence and be able to maybe have their voice heard on that, Councillor Allen. Anything beyond year one is kind of challenging because part of what we're trying to navigate is the compounding impact of deferring work year on year on year, and so it gets to a point where it's so big and large that you can't do it all in year 20. In terms of how we engage community on that, we probably just need to have a chat to the team about what we can adequately resource. But it does feel like, and we'll probably touch on this in boot camp a little bit later, but it does feel like putting a spotlight on the consequence of the capping of our capital program and what that might mean in terms of some things not being able to progress at the level that they may have in the past, or that people think they might into the future, is an important focus area Lisa and her team could pick up that we could leverage into community. And we can use some examples within that engagement piece, so we might not be able to use every single line, but we could use some examples.
Monique, doesn't it start with like just when we have a spreadsheet like this, having like labels against these different lines where we're actually saying critical, essential, like high priority. So like, can you get a sense of like, because I think that's the, like picking up on Councillor Allen's point, is I think that's the part of what the community will want to see is weighing up a project against the context of all the other projects, not just like looking at a project on its own, just as a specific line. It's like what it looks like in the context of everything else, and so it's that kind of helping that trade-off discussion. What's more important, water infrastructure or a park upgrade? You know, like we want to be able to see that and understand why we've included stuff and why stuff is not there.
Yeah, and obviously in the current financial year, we've had the P1 to P6 categorisation. And the conversations internal is that the P1 to P6 doesn't work when you're talking about future because, like, for example, P1 is committed work. Like so some of those things become irrelevant. We did have a very brief conversation this morning about trying to develop a prioritisation framework to get your feedback on today, but just capacity has not allowed us to get there in time. But it may be that we could have a go to bring that to you next Wednesday to get your feedback so that could guide at least year one of the work program so that we can go out to the community with a bit of a guise around, well, here are the things that would likely fall under the line and not be funded in the first couple of years of the LTP. Would that meet council's expectations?
Any other questions for the table? Okay, thanks everybody.
I was just going to comment, if in looking at that spreadsheet which we loaded up to the portal last week, if there are things that you're seeing where it's, hey, I thought we talked about this, or I thought this had been addressed, just flick me an email. We probably need to check that the spreadsheet's talking to the right, any of those changes that were made between activity statements and all those workshops we had with council, but it's a good assurance piece for us internally as well. So would appreciate that sooner rather than later so that we can test that internally.
In that case, there's just one, I guess, big one I want clarity on now, and that's the Taraika Reserves, which is obviously brand new. It's applicable to growth, but it's in a renewal category and it's $7.5 million in the first year. So when development's not necessarily trending that way, or even, like, is it even in the right space? Maybe part of it should be, but I wouldn't imagine the whole lot is applied to a renewal. Like for like.
Yeah, and obviously we've got a program which was based off long-term plan amendment, and that's almost what's being presented through following the original review in November, December. So that had historically been committed by council, but we do have an upcoming workshop where we will talk Taraika, and that's looking at seeking council direction around what's been committed to already in terms of investment in wastewater, the plant upgrades, the intention around moving forward with east-west arterial, reconfirming that alongside the balance of that investment before we go back to Crown Infrastructure Partners. So that briefing is scheduled, I think, for the 23rd. It's certainly coming up in the next couple of weeks.
Okay, thanks everybody.
I hope we're not frightening too many of the public that are live streaming, watching the live stream with us, Grayson. Just putting down the curtains if anyone's interested.